So in this lesson, we're going to continue to build out the user interface that can interact with the API. So we're listing out all of the users. When you click one of the users, it's going to create a separate page for them. And then from here, you can select that user information and you can send an update. And that's tracking within the console. When we send an update, it's getting that updated information. It's got the user ID and the name. So it's ready to make the put request to the API in order to update the content on the server side. So that's going to be coming up in the next lesson. So this lesson, we're just creating the interface and the user interaction to prepare to send the post data. Also for the main click button, that's just reloading back to the main page as well. We left the previous lesson by connecting to the API and being able to list out the items in the API, and then also having the different page nut buttons so we can load the two different pages of content. Now there's a number of different endpoints here that we can make a request to, and another endpoint that we can request to is users and getting by the user ID. So this is a way that we can have the ability to click and be able to select the user and create a user page. So that's what we're going to do in this lesson, where we'll create a user page, and this will be whatever the ID value is. So we're passing in the ID value into the user page. So let's add the ability to do that, and for now we'll console log the ID value, and then we can construct the path and make the fetch request afterwards. So first we're going to start out by logging out the ID whenever the item or whenever the user gets clicked. So we've got all of the users that are going to be contained as we're building out the page content. The user information is all contained within output 1. So let's go ahead and add the event listener. So output 1, add event listener. And of course the event that we're listening for is going to be a click. And whenever it gets clicked, then we want to get whatever the ID value is of the current user, and we have that contained within the user ID. So send that information over within the function. So let's see what happens. So now we can click, we're getting the ID values, and that's the first step in building up and setting up our fetch request to load the user information. So going back to the guide that we have for generating, we need to select, and within users we just pass in whatever the ID value is. So it's API users, and this is where the important part is, just creating the correct path to return back the data. And for now we're just going to console log the data that gets returned back, and it actually should just be the user information. So clear and click, and there's the data for the user. So we can output that user information, and I know in this case there's nothing that's different than what we currently have, but in this case we want to just generate a user page with this data. So create page with the data, and we don't need any of the support data, so we're just going to do data and pass that object in to the create page function. And so next up we create the create page function, and we're getting data passed in, and then first thing I usually like to do is just to log out the contents so that I know I have what I have to work with. And let's do the same thing that we did for the main page, where we're clear out the page contents and then add the user information to the page. We can do pretty much very similar to what we just did earlier. So copying this block of code, and we can also even simplify this by add user, and because output is global, we should be able to add all of this information. So as long as we've got the user information that we're passing in here, the rest should just get generated. and then we can use the same function to create the other user. So let's clear that and just do an add user. So it adds the user information to the page, but we can also use the add user by passing in the user data when we do create a page. And this is actually going to be different. It's data, so we didn't call it user. So now when I click one of them, it should just build out that user information. And I do want to remove out the option where making it clickable. So let's make one minor adjustment where we're adding the event listener to output 1. And for add user, we're going to return back the parent, which is output 1. And that way we can add the event listener to the parent where we're sending over the request to add the user. So within the add user, this is going to be the main element, and then for the main element we can add the event listener, and then we don't have to add it on the other option. So now that one's not clickable, and that means that we can set the attribute of that element, and I'll return it back as main as well. And let's set the attribute of main using set attribute, and the attribute that we're setting is content editable, and just set that to true. Now of course you could set up these as input fields as well. So what we can do now is we can edit the content, and also let's append one more object, and this will be update button. So we can send an update value to this. And using the same structure that we have before where we're making the node, we'll add this button. And this button will have the text content of update, and we're going to append it to the main object. So save, click, and now we should have a button at the bottom there. And for the update button style, and I'll set it to display block, so that way it will go all the way across. And then also we can apply to center it as well. Maybe the easiest way is just to update a class and create a class for update button. Display style is going to be block, and width for this can be 50%, and then let's set the margin to auto so it centers it, and also the text align to center as well. And this way we can just add in all of the class information, so we don't have to do it separately. So using class list add, and add the class of update button. So let's check it out and see what that looks like. So now we've got the update button there at the bottom, and we're able to edit the content. So when the button gets clicked, update button, add event listener, and the event that we're listening for is a click on the button. So whenever the button gets clicked, we want to get all of the information from that parent element. So let's output the content into the console. So setting up a name, or we'll just call it user name. So we want to get the contents of that first element, that first div. So from main, we can do query selector, and if we do query selector all and just select the div elements, and then console log, and actually this is going to be all of the div elements, and then that way we can get each individual div when we press the update, and within the node list we've got the two divs. And I'm also going to separate out the ID, so where we're adding the user, so separating out the ID. into a separate div. So that way it's going to be easier to pick that up. And you might also want to create inputs and also create a separate screen. So that's up to you. I'm just trying to do a quick demonstration. So that's why I'm going to include everything, and I'm going to pick up the information from the divs. So let's set up HTML3. And this will just have the user ID information. So we'll have the email, we'll have the ID, and then we'll also add this as a div to the page. And so it's all going to be editable, and technically you probably don't want to make the ID editable. So we could also hide the ID value as well, so we don't have to output it. We could hide it within the first div, so within div 1, user ID, and that we can set as the user ID. So now that we're selecting the divs from the page, let's console log the div elements and select the first one and see if we've got a user ID there that we can pick up. And if we can get that information, then we can get the username and also have it editable as well. So clear, and now when we hit update, we're getting the value of 3. So this is returning back the third person. So the ID is 3 on this user, and we're able to pick it up because we hid it in the background. So also for this one, this will be whatever the username is. So whatever text content we have in this element. So we hit update, we get the name, and also if we want the email address, we could get the text content of the second element. So that's going to give us all the parameters that we need to send over. And that way we can make a post or a put to the endpoint to send the request. So let's make that selection and put them into variables. And I'll put it into an object user info. And I usually like to use objects for these. So this is going to be the name and whatever we've got here for the content that we were originally outputting. And then comma, separate that. And the next one is going to be the ID. And that's coming back from this parameter. And then the last one is the email. And that information is going to be contained within the text content of the second div. So save that, and we'll console log the user info to make sure that we've got it properly. So we click it, we can clear the console, and as soon as we hit update, we're creating the user information, so we're ready to post that information on the update. So that's coming up in the next lesson. So this lesson, continue to build out the application, make the users clickable, and then also get the user information. So the other option as well is to do it differently than I did it. So in this case, I just wanted to have some updatable fields, and I'm able to update that, and then that information I can then send over to the server side with the post and the put request. You can also add these as input fields, and again, depending on what the parameters are for the data that you're updating, you might want to make some adjustments to the way that you're presenting the content for the user. In this lesson, we're going to continue to build out the application and interact with the front-end API. So loading the users, creating a separate page for the users, and then also creating an update button on that page and allowing the user to update the content that's being presented on the page in preparation for being able to send an update request to the endpoint for the user object.